Hello, this is Eric Michael Loyd. I have a master's in science and psychology, neuropsychology concentration. I wanted to read this book called Don't Be Evil, at least the first 27 pages of it. This book, Don't Be Evil by Rana Foroohar, Financial Times business columnist and author of Makers and Takers. It's a preview of this book. Don't Be Evil, How Big Tech Betrayed Its Founding Principles and All of Us. Rana Foroohar. This is published by Currency, New York, and it has a copyright for 2019. The author's note at the beginning of the book reads, some books are born out of big, abstract ideas. Others start closer to home. My last book, Makers and Takers, came out of high-level policy conversations about the financial industry. This book, which examines the economic, political, and cognitive damage wrought by the technology industry over the past 20 years, has a wide lens. But its birth was quite intimate. It began one afternoon in late April of 2017 when I came home from work, opened my credit card bill, and got a shock. Over $900 in charges I didn't recognize from Apple's App Store. First, I thought I'd been hacked. After making a few inquiries, however, I discovered that, in fact, my then 10-year-old son had racked up these charges, buying virtual players for the online soccer game he had become fond of. His devices were summarily confiscated and passwords revoked, needless to say. But right around that time, the larger implications of this incident were beginning to consume my time and attention, albeit in a different way. I was starting a new job as the global business columnist for the Financial Times, the world's largest business newspaper. My mandate was to write a weekly column about the biggest economic stories of the day, and most turned out to involve the big tech behemoths of our era, companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, and of course, Apple. It's no secret that the concentration of market power has been rising in numerous industries over the past few decades, a trend that has been linked to everything from growing income inequality to slower economic growth to a surge in political populism. But as I settled into my new role at the FT and began digging into the financial data, I discovered something rather shocking, that 80% of corporate wealth was now being held by just 10% of companies. And these weren't the firms that owned most physical assets and commodities. They weren't the GEs, or the Toyotas, or the Exxon Mobils. Rather, they were those that had figured out how to leverage the new oil of our economy, information and networks. Many of these new superstars were technology companies. The tech industry provides the starkest illustration of the rise in monopolistic power in the world today. 90% of the searches conducted everywhere on the planet are performed on a single search engine, Google. 95% of all internet using adults under the age of 30 are on Facebook and or Instagram, which Facebook acquired in 2012. Millennials spend twice as much time on YouTube as they do on all other video streaming services combined. Google and Facebook together receive around 90% of the world's new ad spending, and Google and Apple's operating systems run on all but 1% of all cell phones globally. Apple and Microsoft supply 95% of the world's desktop operating systems. Amazon takes half of all US e-commerce sales. The list goes on and on. Everything in big tech goes big or it doesn't go at all. And the bigger it gets, the more likely it is to go bigger still. The wealth reaped by digital giants has been extraordinary. The market capitalizations of the five so-called FAANG companies, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, now exceed the economy of France. Measured by users, Facebook alone is larger than the world's largest country, China. But as the big have gotten bigger, the rest of the economy has suffered. Over the past 2 decades, as big tech has grown, more than half of all public firms have disappeared. Our economy has become more concentrated, and both business dynamism and entrepreneurship have declined. As I wrote and reported, raising concerns about all of this in the pages of FT, I felt growing unease over the things I was hearing from a broad swath of people, workers, consumers, parents, and investors, who felt big tech was putting their livelihoods, or even their lives, or those people who they loved, in jeopardy. They were the mothers and fathers who struggled with tech-addicted children, the workers who lost jobs when their business went bankrupt trying to compete with Amazon, the entrepreneur who had his ideas and intellectual property stolen by a competitor and lacked the funds to bring his complaint to court, the homeowner who was denied property insurance because the provider's algorithms determined he was too high a risk. Then there were those who simply felt that the entire tech industry wasn't sharing enough of the wealth pie fairly. And what a pie it is. Big tech firms are now the richest and most powerful countries on the face of the planet. The internet desirability of their various products and platforms, coupled with the network effect in which more users beget still more and all the data that they can harvest as a result, has allowed them to scale unimaginable dimensions. They have used their size to crush or absorb competitors, to commandeer the personal data of their users, and, in the case of Google, Facebook, and Amazon, to leverage it for their own benefit and the form of highly targeted advertising. They and other big tech firms have also offshored much of their exorbitant profit. According to the one estimate done by Credit Suisse in 2019, the top 10 companies offshoring the most savings, including Apple, Microsoft, Oracle, Alphabet, the parent company of Google, and Qualcomm, had $600 billion sitting in overseas accounts, circumventing the laws and regulations by which ordinary citizens must abide, but which the largest corporations can legally eschew. Silicon Valley has lobbied hard to preserve the tax loopholes that allow this, bringing to mind the words of economist Mancur Olson, who warned that a civilization declines when the moneyed interests take over its politics. Certainly, Many public officials I spoke with echoed my concerns. Silicon Valley was, after all, built around government, that is, taxpayer funded innovation. Everything from GPS mapping to touch screens to the internet itself came out of research originally done or funded by the U.S. Department of Defense and was later commercialized by Silicon Valley. Yet, unlike many other countries, including a number of thriving free markets such as Finland and Israel, the U.S. taxpayer does not reap a penny of the profits these innovations yield. Instead, these companies were offshoring both profits and labor at the very time that tech titans were asking the government to spend more money on things like educational reform to ensure that the 21st century workforce would be digitally savvy. The consequences are not just economic. By fueling populist discontent with capitalism and liberal democracy, they have high stakes political ramifications too. For someone who'd been tracking the financial industry closely since 2007, the parallels were fascinating. There was a new, too big to fail, too complex to manage industry out there, one that had grown like ragweed under our noses. It had more wealth and a bigger market capitalization than any other industry in history, yet it created fewer and fewer jobs than the behemoths of the past. It was reshaping our economy and labor force in profound ways, turning people into products via the collection and monetization of their personal data, and yet went virtually unregulated. And much like the banking system circa 2008, it was flexing its considerable political and economic muscle to ensure that things stayed that way. As I began looking more closely at these companies, which were already under fire in the wake of revelations about the 2016 election results, a picture began to form. As we now know, the largest technology platform companies in the world, including Facebook, Google, and Twitter, were exploited by Russian actors to manipulate the results of the U.S. presidential election in favor of Donald J. Trump. These platforms are no longer just places to search for cheap airfare post-vacation photos or connect with long-lost family and friends. Instead, they have become tools for manipulating geopolitics and swinging the fate of nations, while enriching their executives and shareholders in the process. The innocence of an earlier era was behind us. That's an important point to remember, because when it comes to the tech industry, it hasn't always been about the money. In fact, Silicon Valley was heavily influenced by the counterculture movements of the 60s, with many entrepreneurs inspired by a vision of a future in which technology held the power to make the world a better, safer, and more prosperous place for everyone. The digital utopians preaching this vision adhered to a strict gospel that information wanted to be free, and that the internet would be democratizing democratizing force, leveling the playing field for us all. There was a time when the high priests of the internet were not cited on Forbes lists of the richest people on the planet. Rather, they were cited across the newly created blogosphere as the creators of Linux, Wikipedia, and other open source platforms, communities built on the assumption that the trust and transparency would prevail over greed and profit. All of which raises the question, how did we get here? How did an industry that had once been scrappy, innovative, and optimistic become, in the span of just a few decades, greedy, insular, and arrogant. How did we get from a world where information wants to be free to a one in which data exists to be monetized? How did a movement built on the goal of democratizing information come to all but destroy the very fabric of our democracy? How did its leaders go from tinkering with motherboards in their basements to dominating our political economy? The answer is, as I soon come to believe, is that we reached a tipping point in which the interests of the largest tech firms and customers and citizens they supposedly serve were no longer aligned. Over the past 20 years, Silicon Valley has given us amazing things, from search to social media to portable devices with astounding computing power. We hold today in our pockets more computing intelligence than entire companies had access to just a generation ago. And yet, these modern conveniences have come at a steep price. Twitchy technology addiction that saps our time and productivity, spread of misinformation and hate speech, predatory algorithms targeting the weak and vulnerable, and a total loss of personal privacy. The accumulation of more and more of the country's wealth by a smaller and smaller subset of society. What's more, all of these problems, while often spoken about in isolation, are intertwined. There was a single, inescapable problem, a business model based largely on keeping people online as long as possible and monetizing their attention. That's something that many people in the Valley didn't want to acknowledge. The attention merchants, as Columbia University academic Tim Wu has labeled big tech firms, use behavioral persuasion, troves of personal data, and network effects to achieve monopoly power, which ultimately affords them political power, which in turn helps them hold onto their monopolies. In the past, Facebook, Google, and Amazon have been given regulatory get-out-of-jail-free cards. After all, the logic goes, Google provides its searches for free, Facebook is free to join, and Amazon cuts prices and gives away products for free. Isn't that good for customers? The problem is that free isn't actually free. We don't pay for most digital services in dollars, but we do pay dearly with our data and our attention. People are the resource that's being monetized. We think we are consumers. In fact, we are the product. Of course, these are problems many leaders in Silicon Valley don't much want us to land on. Too many powerful people there remain in a cognitive bubble, reluctant to engage fully and transparently with legitimate public concerns, including safeguarding our data. Whether artificial intelligence and automation will take too many jobs, our loss of privacy as our location is tracked on a second-by-second basis by thousands of apps, electronic manipulation, and even why the shiny devices that permeate every aspect of our lives today are what they're doing to our brains. When I ask most techies about the concerns, reactions tend to range from defensive to naive, clueless, or worst of all, a patronizing smile or exasperated look that says, "You're not a tech insider, and thus you don't get it." But it may be the tech executives themselves who don't get it. As John Battelle, who helped launch Wired magazine, once put it to me, the tech community doesn't have a good perspective on itself. We aren't humanists or philosophers. We are engineers. To Google and Facebook, people are algorithms. It all seems too familiar. I am old enough to have lived through one big boom and bust tech cycle, having worked for a high-tech incubator in London from 1999 to 2000, an experience I'll describe in a later chapter of this book. Then, as now, the industry was talking mainly to itself. The hubris we set today has reached levels we haven't seen since the years leading up to the dot-com collapse. Only this time around, it's more pernicious, given that companies like Amazon and Apple have become mainstays in just about every household in America. Like the big Wall Street banks, they hold vast amounts of money and power and even greater troves of data. They, yet, unlike Goldman Sachs chief executive Lloyd Blankfein, they are not joking when they claim to be doing God's work. Attend any tech conference, and you'll quickly learn that many in Silicon Valley still subscribe to the notion that they have made the world more free and open, despite plenty of evidence to the contrary. The Valley has clearly moved away from its hippie entrepreneurial roots. Big tech chief executives are as rapaciously capitalist as any financier, but often with an added libertarian bent. Theirs is a worldview in which anything and everything, government, politics, civic society, and law, can and should be destructive. As big tech critic Jonathan Taplin once put it to me, demos, society itself, is often viewed as being in the way. So why haven't our political leaders imposed any sensible regulations to hold such instincts in check? Follow the money. Not for nothing that big tech now vies with Wall Street and Big Pharma as one of the top spenders on political lobbying. Just as in the years before the 2008 financial crisis, the world's top bankers dispatched surrogates to Washington, London, and Brussels to live among and lobby legislators in charge of regulating. So Silicon Valley faces have become the most familiar ones in these capitals over the past decade, with Google dispatching so many emissaries to Washington that they needed office space as large as the White House to hold them all. But despite the efforts of scores of Silicon Valley lobbyists and PR teams, the public worries about the economic and social effects of technology, and those worries are not going away. In fact, they are increasing as the technology itself spreads more deeply into our economy, politics, and culture. Big tech has become the new Wall Street, and as such, is the prime target for populist backlash in a world increasingly bifurcated economically and socially. The changes big tech has brought have become one of the most pressing economic issues of our time. Harvard Business School professor Emerita Shoshana Zuboff and other scholars have decried the rise of surveillance capitalism, which is, as Zuboff defines it, a new economic order that claims human experience as free raw material for hidden commercial practices of extraction, prediction, and sales, as well as a parasitic economic logic in which the production of goods and services is subordinated to a new global architecture of behavioral modification via digital surveillance technologies. She believes, and I would agree, that surveillance capitalism represents a significant threat to our economic and political systems, as well as a potential instrument for social control. I've also come to believe that curbing Silicon Valley's nefarious side effects will become the signature economic issue for lawmakers over the next 5 years, especially as automation increases and they make investments into other areas of the economy. As one staffer for influential senior Democratic senator has put it to me. That this isn't just a story for the business pages. In fact, big tech is at the center of nearly every story in the news today, ranking second only to stories about Donald Trump and the press. Yet, while the president will leave us eventually, big tech is forever, transforming our existence a little more each day, as the technology itself spreads more deeply into our economy, politics, and culture. It's an alchemy that is just beginning. As amazing as the changes of the past 20 years have been, they are only the first stages of a multi-decade transition to a digital economy that will rival the Industrial Revolution in terms of transformative power. And by the time it is complete, the consequences are likely to be even more sweeping, changing the nature of liberal democracy, of capitalism, and even of humanity itself. What big tech is doing in a world big, what big tech is, in a word, big. And while I've been critical of many aspects of this digital transformation, there is no denying the tremendous upside as well. Silicon Valley has been the single greatest creator of corporate wealth in history. It has connected the world, helped spark revolutions against oppressive governments, even as it has also facilitated repression, and created entirely new paradigms for invention and innovation. Platform technologies allow many of us to work remotely, maintain distant relationships, develop new talents, market our businesses, and share our views, our creative expression, or our products with a global audience. Big tech has given us the tools to call up a variety of goods and services, from transportation to food to medical treatment on demand, and generally live in a way that is more convenient and efficient than ever before. In these and many other senses, the digital revolution is a miraculous and welcome development. But in order to ultimately reap the benefits of technology in a broad way, we need a level playing field so that the next generation of innovators is allowed to thrive. We don't yet live in that world. Big tech has reshaped labor markets, exacerbated income inequality, and pushed us into filter bubbles in which we get only the information that confirms the opinions we already have. But it hasn't provided solutions for these problems. Instead of enlightening us, it's narrowing our view. Instead of bringing us together, it's tearing us apart. With each buzz and beep of our phones, each automatically downloaded video, each new content popping up in our digital networks, we get just a glimmer of a vast new world that is, frankly, beyond most people's understanding. A bizarre land of information and misinformation, of trends and tweets, of a high-speed surveillance technology that has become the new normal. Just think, Russian election hacking, hate-mongering Twitter feeds, identity theft, big data, fake news, online scams, digital addiction, self-driving car crashes, the rise of robots, creepy facial recognition technology, Alexa eavesdropping on our every conversation, algorithms that watch us work, play, and sleep, and companies and governments that control them. The list of technology-driven social disruption is endless, and all of it has appeared in just the past few years. Individually, each item is just a speck in the eye, but collectively, it makes for a sleet storm, a freezing whiteout that yields a foggy numbness, the anxious haze of the modern age. The issue is that periods of great technological change are also characterized by great disruption, which needs to be managed for the sake of society as a whole. Otherwise, you end up with events like the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries, which, as historian Niall Ferguson has outlined in his book, The Square and the Tower, might not have happened without the advent of major new technologies like printing press, which eventually brought with it the Age of Enlightenment, but not before it upset old orders in the same way that the internet and social media have upended society today. No one can hold back technology, nor should they, but disruption can and should be better managed than it has in the past. We have the tools to do so. The challenge for us today is figuring out how to put boundaries around a technology industry that has become more powerful than many individual countries. If we can create a framework for fostering innovation and sharing the prosperity in a much broader way, while also protecting people from the dark side of digital technologies, then the next few decades could be a golden era of global growth. This book is an attempt to shine a light on the things about big tech that should worry us and what we can do to fix them. I hope that it will serve as a wake-up call, not just for executives and policymakers, but for anyone who believes in a future in which the benefits of innovation and progress outweigh the costs to individuals and to society. It's in everyone's interest to believe that we can create that kind of future, because as we come to understand all too clearly over the past few years, once people stop believing that a system is good for them, the system falls apart. That's the author's note of this part of the book. I'll go ahead and read the next part of Don't Be Evil right after the end of this video. Thank you again for your time.